Hey, good morning. Happy Easter. Happy Resurrection Day. It's just a wonderful day to be alive. Although we're stuck in the house, we still can celebrate the resurrection and Easter. And this morning, to do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Shroud of Turin, which is a remarkable cloth that we have from history. And it's interesting that, let me bring this up actually here. So it's interesting that we have this cloth that is evidence for the resurrection, and we've got a lot of other evidence as well for the resurrection. So you've got the fact that we've got eyewitness testimony. We've got just the change in the disciples. The disciples, and how they went from being afraid to boldly proclaiming that Jesus had died and was resurrected. We've got the change in Paul, who was persecuting the church. We've got James, who was Jesus' brother. He also was the leader of the Jerusalem church later, and he was not a believer until the resurrection. So there's lots of evidence. There's predictive prophecy. But then we've got this other piece of evidence, the Shroud of Turin. And this is the kind of thing where I think God wants everybody to come to know him, and he's going to give everybody enough evidence that they can. And it goes from just what we see around us in nature to all the way to something like the Shroud of Turin, which is this one-of-a-kind piece of cloth that matches up with this one-of-a-kind event that takes place in history. So I'm going to be talking about that today. Let me go ahead and make sure that I've got this part working. Okay, so I don't see anything in there now, but I think it'll pop up. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yes, he is risen. Good morning, Sharon. How are you? And hello. Good morning, Christina. Thanks for joining me. So again, the Shroud of Turin. So what is it? And let's make sure. Actually, I can't see this yet. We go back to here. And that looks pretty good. Okay. So the Shroud of Turin, you can kind of see a little picture of it here. So it's this cloth that they found. Well, actually, they didn't find it. I'll go through some of the history here. So it's something that's been with us throughout history, although the actual time when we have historical documentation of it goes anywhere back from, let's say, 500 AD, but really, if you want to be really conservative, we'll see that it's a little bit later than that. But you can see here that it's the image on it's very faint. You can't even see it in here, but what you can see is the burn marks that were later repaired. That was from a fire that happened. But it's a 14.5 foot or so long piece of cloth, about 3.5 feet wide. And this is what we believe Jesus was buried in, and there's really good evidence for this as we see. And there's so much evidence for it that I really feel like this applies. So this is from Luke. It says, he said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. And that's really kind of the way I see this cloth, is that after with all the evidence that we have for Jesus, and a lot of people may not be aware of all of that evidence, but if you look at this piece of cloth, and you can't believe, or at least want to realize there's something going on here, then you're just never going to believe, I think. I think this is one of the things that God put out there that said, all right, this is for everybody who's a skeptic, who needs scientific evidence, let's say, who needs something to show that this event really happened. And we'll talk about that today. And I just realized my little thing has not moved, so hang on one second. A little technical difficulty again. Go back to here. There it is. Okay, so that's what I was just saying. He said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. So as far as the history of the shroud, it was, again, the first historical record, verified record, was in 1349 in France. There was this person who wanted to build a church there and have the shroud there. And there was actually correspondence about the shroud even before this. And there really was documentation back as early as Edessa and then Constantinople, and we'll see evidence that there was even earlier than this. But if you look at the really conservative estimates, they say 1349 in France, and then it was deeded to the House of Savoy, 1453, and then in 1532 is when that chapel fire happened, and that's when it was in a box that had silver in it, and the fire was so hot that it started melting the silver, and that burned through some of the shroud that was folded up there. So that's the damage marks that you saw there. It was repaired by nuns. And then they put the little ugly patches on there. And then it was moved to Turin in 1578, and that's why we call it the Shroud of Turin. Now, this is really interesting. So there's this book called the Pray Codex, and it's not called Pray because people pray. It's actually the guy's name who found it. Later was Pray, but this was in Hungary, and this was written 1192 to 1195. What's really interesting about this is there's pictures in there, and these particular two pictures are really interesting. So what you have here, this is Joseph of Arimathea, this is Nicodemus, and this is, I believe, John. And this, of course, is Jesus. And what's a couple of interesting things here. He's got a little blood stain here on his head, in the exact place where the shroud is, but there's more than that. He's got his hands crossed in the same way that the hands are crossed in the shroud image, and we'll see that. This is not actually the shroud that he's laying on. This is actually a garment where you would put your head through. So there's thoughts that this was just some garment that they were laying him on. The shroud is actually here around Joseph's shoulder, and he's holding it right here in his hand, and then it's around here, and then John is holding it, and it's kind of around his shoulder as well. So here you've got this long cloth. So obviously they realized there was a long shroud that Jesus was buried in. And then here's a really interesting thing down here. So this is after the resurrection. So here you've got the Marys, so to speak, the three Marys. And then you've got the angel here, and you've got the shroud, and I'm going to blow this up a little bit. So on this image of the shroud right here, they purposely put the herringbone weave. This is a very fine piece of cloth. There was a herringbone weave on the shroud. And they put that on there. And then also you can see they have these L-shaped holes, and these are called poker holes. These holes were actually on the shroud prior to that church fire that happened. They don't know exactly how these got in there. It could have been a piece of coal that fell down when they were burning some incense, or a hot poker or something like that. So they call them poker holes. And you can see they're in this L shape here on this image of the shroud. And then, of course, you've got, this is the real shroud right here. So this is a very distinct portion of the cloth in addition to the image of Jesus that's on it. So this tells us that the shroud was around in, I think it's the Byzantine area, Constantinople, before before it was in France. So here you've got 1192 to 1195, right? So that's dated before that. And this is also a couple of hundred years before the carbon dating, which we're going to talk about the carbon dating that says it was a medieval fake, but we know now that the carbon dating was not taken from a good piece of the cloth, and we'll talk about that. So you've got 1192 and 1195. And then here, again, this was painted in 1516 before that fire in the chapel. And you can see here they don't have, first of all, they don't have the burn marks as shown from the fire in the chapel where they patched it up. But they do have the image, and they have the poker holes on here. So we know the poker holes were in there before that fire. This was painted in 1516, the shroud. So here's where it really gets interesting. So in 1898, right around the time that photography was like this, where you had this big box camera and you had to set it up and nobody could move, that kind of thing, this guy by the name of Secundapia was able to take a picture of the shroud when it was being shown. And of course, this is what the shroud looks like if you're close up looking at it. It's a very faint image, and you can see here the faint image of a face. You can see some blood here coming down, a drip of blood. This would have been from the crown of thorns. And you can see a very faint face. But when he took the picture, and then he went into his darkroom, or I guess they had darkrooms back then, he had to develop the plates, and he looked at the negative. It turns out that the negative was actually a positive, which means that the shroud is actually a negative. So all of a sudden you have, because this is a positive image, you have all of this really interesting detail that comes out. Again, you can see the blood. You can see a lot more about his face here. And if you look at the whole shroud this way, the whole shroud, you can see the full body of the man who was laying in the shroud, who I believe obviously was Jesus. So he took this picture, and then the church saw it, and the church thought he had faked it. So this was the only picture that was taken for a really long time. And everybody thought it was a fake, and he couldn't convince anybody. But thankfully, he was alive. They took another picture, and I think this is actually the picture from 1931. They took another picture in 1931 and saw exactly the same thing. So then they realized that it was indeed a negative image that's imprinted on the shroud of a real person, front and back, both sides. So in 1976, there were some scientists at Los Alamos that knew of the shroud, they knew of the picture, and they had this device called a VP8, and this is something that would be used for looking at depth kinds of things, like if you're going to look at a planet and you wanted to know what the depth of the mountains are. I think the geography and some other things could be used in medical kinds of things. So they wanted to see what it would look like if you took an image of the shroud, a picture of the shroud, and put it under this VP8. And if you take a picture of a person, like if I just took a picture of somebody, I stuck it under this device, this VP8, it would be all distorted because the picture was not created from a three-dimensional kind of surface. You know, it's just a flat picture, and the dark and the light doesn't really correspond to anything. But when they took a picture of the shroud in this device, and you can see here's the picture of the shroud they were looking at, and this is what comes up. It actually provided a 3D image where you can see the parts that are supposed to be elevated, like the nose, the mustache, the chin, the hair, kind of the eyebrows or the forehead. You can see the eyes are a little sunken in. And again, you don't get this with a regular picture. And the reason this is possible is because what they showed was that the shroud picture, or the image on the shroud, was made when the shroud was laying over an actual person. So it's not just a flat picture, it was actually laying over a person, so there's actually a three-dimensional depth encoded in that. So Sharon, why is it called the Shroud of Turin? Yeah, that's true, and I think I may have mentioned that after you said this question. So it's because it's in Turin, Italy. So it moved around, started in, again, they think it was in Edessa after the disciples kind of went, fleed away from Jerusalem. They went to other places, and I think they were in Edessa where they had taken the shroud, and then it was in, during the Crusades, it was hidden in a wall for a while. And this is all history that's somewhat documented, but, it's questionable. And then went to Constantinople, and then, from there it was documented in France, and then eventually to Turin, Italy, is why it's called the Shroud of Turin. So that was a couple years ago, before this. So in 76, I think I said it was. And then in 78, these scientists that had looked at this thought, that's remarkable. We need to figure out how this image got on the shroud. And they really thought it was painted, but they were like, how could it be painted and be 3D? Because, again, if you took a painting, it would not come up 3D under this device. So it had to be laid on something somehow. So they wanted to figure out how this was made. So they were given 24-hour access to it for 5 days. That's a lot of time, and they ran a lot of tests. You can see here a list of some of the tests that they ran. So there were 33 scientists, and they ran pretty much every test they had at that time in the 70s. X-rays, spectrometry, these microscopes. They took 30,000 photographs. They took particle samples, so they took tape and they took fibers off of it. And when they were done, well, you can see here also, they had no religious assumptions. So these guys were not coming at it like, we're going to try to prove that this is the burial shroud of Christ. In fact, they really were, in a way, trying to prove that it was painted on there somehow. That's a lot of these tests would be looking for paint and the kinds of things that you would use if you can use paint and have it stick onto a linen cloth. And then everything that they did had to be peer-reviewed by other scientists, all their findings. And in the end, in 1981, they came out with their findings that said the shroud image is that of a human form, so it's a real human person, of a scourged, crucified man. So they came to the conclusion that this person was scourged and crucified. It's not a product of an artist. They said the blood stains were real. They're comprised of hemoglobin. You give a positive test for serum albumin. That means it's mammal blood, basically. And then also they've been able to type the blood on this, and it's come out to somewhat rare, AB. And then what's interesting is there's a face cloth that's separate, that's in Spain, that has blood on it that is also AB positive. And that has been held over all this time as saying it was the cloth that was placed over Jesus' face before he was put in the shroud. So he was taken down from the cross. They put this cloth over his face, kind of to hide his face like we might do today. And that has blood all over it. There's no image on that one. And the blood types actually match between the shroud and that cloth. So they say the image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, the problem remains unsolved. So they came to the conclusion several of them came to the conclusion, these were people that were skeptics, that this had a really good chance of being the historical, or the cloth that buried the historical Jesus. That's as far as they would go. They wouldn't talk about miracles, but they'd say this seems to be the cloth that Jesus was buried in because of the fact that it was a scourged, crucified man, and everything kind of matched on this cloth with the accounts that we have from the Gospels. So in 1988, another group of people were given access to take a sample to do radiocarbon dating. And they took that sample, I think this is probably where they actually were cutting it, and then they sent that sample to 3 different labs to get 3 different opinions on the date to try to be as careful as possible. But unfortunately, really what they're supposed to do is supposed to take 3 different samples from 3 different parts of the cloth, but this was the Shroud of Turin, so they were, I guess, lucky to get just a little piece that the Vatican, whoever it is, the Pope, said they could have. So they had these 3 pieces or that's 1 piece of cloth that they cut, and then they divided that into 3 pieces, and they were going to do that radiocarbon dating. So you can see here they had the 1 piece of cloth, and it was cut up into these different pieces. And it came back after all this carbon dating that the shroud was a medieval fraud. They dated it from 1260 to 1390. And at that point, the people who had looked at it, the STURP team that went, all the scientists said, well, wow, that's really, really, really surprising. They thought it was actually from the 1st century. But they were going to go with the carbon dating because they're scientists. But what's really interesting about this story is, again, how God can use people, just regular old people. So these were a couple of kitchen table kinds of investigators, Sue Benford and Joseph Marino, and they had access to all the pictures that were taken of the shroud, and they had access to the pictures of the pieces that were used for the carbon dating sample. And they were looking at it, and they noticed when they were looking at it that there were some, and you can't really see it here, but there were some threads that seemed to be thicker and thinner, and it seemed that the way that the threads were interwoven were different. It just didn't look the same as the rest of the cloth that there were pictures of as well. So they had done some research, and they had heard about a technique called invisible French reweaving, where, and again, the shroud was in France for a period of time, for a long period of time, where they would take different threads from, if you had your damaged piece of cloth, they would take another piece of cloth, and usually cotton, and they would then they'd take all of the little ends of the fibers, and they'd wind them back together so it looked like they were 1 cloth, and they would dye the cotton so that it would match the linen. Linen you can't really dye, so they would dye the cotton to match the color of the linen. So this was their theory, and they published a paper on it. It was never peer-reviewed or anything like that, but they just published a paper on it. And you can see here, it's very interesting. This is one of the things that they looked at. So you can see where they took the sample. So this was the sample right here that they cut out. This was retained for later. This was something called a Ray's fragment that another person by the name of Ray had. So you can see as they go down, here's the different segments that they took, and you can see the dates progressively get earlier for each one. So this was sent to Arizona, this piece was sent to Zurich, this was sent to Oxford, and this was sent to Arizona. And you can see that the dates get earlier and earlier here. So that was an interesting clue as well. It's like if there was some French reweaving going on here, if there was a repair and some more modern or medieval cotton fibers in here, and more of it, but there was less up here and more down here where this repair was made and the stuff was woven back together, that would be a good indication right there as these dates go down like this. So there's a guy by the name of Ray Rogers who was on the STURP team that examined the shroud for those 5 days, 24 hours. I'm sure he got some sleep, but other people were around it for 24 hours examining this thing. And he, had come to the conclusion that, just like everybody else, this was not a painting. There was no gums or mordants holding anything together in there. The paint, and you can see everything that he's done here, his qualifications. So he was a man who did not tolerate people like Marino and Binford, and he called them kind of the lunatic fringe. And he had heard lots of different theories as to why the carbon dating was false, And he called all those people lunatics because he believed in carbon dating and realized that, it just has to be from that time frame. So he set out to prove them wrong. But when he was, and this is an example of this French reweaving. So this would be linen cloth here, and this is an actual sample. And I believe the sample is from Ray Rogers when he actually realized that Marino and Binford were right. He actually had samples of the cloth. He had the samples that he had taken. And he also had a little bit of that Ray's section, I believe, that was adjacent to the actual piece that they used for the carbon testing. And he found fibers like this, where you've got linen right here, and then you've got cotton coming in here, and it was all woven together. And when you look at it under, I think it was a spectroscope, you can see the linen here, and then you can see the cotton here. You can almost see the fibers winding around. You've got more of it over here, and then you've got less of it over there. So then, and he was amazed, and then he decided he was going to go ahead and get a hold of an actual piece from the testing. Now you destroy the material when you do carbon testing, but they always retain some. So he got some from one of the labs, some of the retained piece, and he found the exact same thing. So he basically came to the conclusion. He said this was in a paper that he went ahead and published. The combined evidence from chemical kinetics, analytical chemistry, cotton content, again there was cotton in there, and pyrolysis MS, proves that the material from the radiocarbon area of the shroud is significantly different from that of the main cloth. The radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and is invalid for determining the age of the shroud. So basically what he was saying was, the carbon dating was correct in a sense, because you've got this material that's got both linen and cotton, and they had checked only the area of the shroud that the image was on, or just generally around it. They didn't go testing the edge. And this particular edge was at the very bottom of the cloth. It's a part of the cloth that was always handled. So you always had hands all over it, and it was damaged already. So the church was like, well, yeah, if you're going to take a sample, go ahead and cut it from here. This is already kind of damaged. So they took it from there. But that's a piece that had been repaired, again, with this cotton fiber. And there was some reweave done in there. And so when you're testing that piece of cloth, you're not testing the same way you would be testing the part of the cloth where the image is. So that's what his paper said. And then he said in a interview later, and I'm actually going to play a piece of that, he said, I'm coming to the conclusion that it has a very good chance of being the piece of cloth that was used to bury the historic Jesus. So this was after the carbon dating. Originally he thought it was possibly the cloth, and then he decided it wasn't because of the carbon dating, and now after he's examined everything for a second time and seen that there's actually cotton in the samples, he said, I'm now believing that this is actually the cloth that was used to bury Jesus. I think I've got a video. Yeah, I'm going to play a video now. So this is actually, the video I'm going to play is from a special that was on Discovery Channel. It was called Unwrapping the Shroud, and you can actually find this on YouTube. So if you get a chance, you should go watch that whole special. It's really quite fascinating. They cover this whole issue with the carbon dating. But I'm going to play a piece of it now where Ray Rogers heard about this theory from Binford and Marino, and then he decides he's going to go prove for himself, or he's going to prove them wrong. So watch this.
Rogers was in a unique position to confirm or dismiss Binford and Marino's theory.
Ray had in his possession, from 1978, the tape samples lifted from the surface of the shroud. But remember, those were not big fibers. Those were fibrils taken from the surface. He also had some samples that were taken from the shroud by Professor Reyes, who took samples in 1973 from a corner that was immediately adjacent to the area taken for carbon dating.
What few realized was that Ray Rogers was in a race against time. He was losing a long battle with cancer. His old friend, Barry Schwartz, recorded this interview to ensure Ray could recount in his own words what he did next.
So I read their paper, and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the rot samples and I got out the shroud samples, and I went to work again.
A couple hours later, he calls me and he goes, "Boy," he says, "I can't believe it." He says, "They were right. There's cotton here." He says, "There's no cotton in the rest of the shroud, but there's cotton interwoven here. They must be right."
No one was more shocked than Rogers himself. His initial observation seemed to confirm Benford and Marino's hypothesis. But he knew to be absolutely certain he needed to examine the threads that were carbon dated.
Until I could get a sample from the real radiocarbon cloth, a documented sample, I couldn't prove anything.
The carbon dating process destroys the sample as part of the dating procedure. But all the labs involved in 1988 had held on to a small sample as a reserve.
The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino had been right. In fact, he found other evidence they had missed, which proved the shroud had been repaired with cotton fibers in exactly the section where the carbon dating samples had been taken.
So you can see that you had several of the members of the team there that were talking about this. So the carbon dating, while it came up to be medieval at the time, you could see why that's really not the case. And I never really, even when I heard that, I never really believed that could be the case, because it just didn't make any sense at all. And we'll talk about a little bit of that. So what do we know from this image? So we know the carbon dating. Well, the carbon dating again was correct as far as dating the fibers that it had. The fibers, a lot of the fibers where it was being taken from had cotton in there, and that was affecting the age that it was showing. So could it, really could it have been a fraud anyway? Let's say they never carbon dated it, or let's say we didn't get this confirmation that there was cotton fiber in there. Could it really even fit the fraud scenario? They know it's not painted or dyed, so you have to think about, if somebody in the Middle Ages were going to create a fraud of the shroud, how would they do it? They'd probably paint it somehow, or they'd put some kind of element on there that the scientists would have been able to see when they did their tests back in 1978, I think it was. Also, it's a negative image. So again, how would a person who was going to create this fraud create a negative image on this cloth? There was no photography back then, and there are some people that will still kind of strain to try to find out a way that could happen. They're like, well, they could have used light coming in through a small hole. They kind of knew that you could do something like that, and then you could put the cloth up there around a form of a person. So there's still people that are trying to figure out how it could be done, but there's just no known way to duplicate it, certainly back then, that it could be done. And again, it's a 3D image. This is from Pete Schumacher. This is one of the guys that helped with the VP8 equipment that I was telling you about. Said it's a very unique image, the only one of its kind in the world, nothing else like it. 3-dimensional relief. The front and back of a whole human being, no other, no where, no how, no way. I don't know any way to make it. Never heard of a way to make it, just the Shroud of Turin. So again, it's a one-of-a-kind thing. And this is an example of, again, the 3D qualities of this. So it's like there's 3D information coded in this. It was, again, laid over a real person, and then this image was created on the cloth. So you can actually take that information, and there's a group that did that. I think it was probably the History Channel. I think it was probably the channel that run that. It was something, I think it was called The Face of Jesus. And they had some folks that took the data kind of from the 3D image, all of the data points, if you map it, and then they decided, well, let's see what the person would have looked like if we assume this was their face. And then again, here's the shroud image, and when they were done, basically this is what they came up with. So it's kind of eerie that this could be what Jesus looked like right here. So what else do we know from the from the shroud. So we know there was a crown of thorns or something like it because there were cuts around the scalp exactly where you would expect to find them. And this was something unique to Jesus. They didn't put crowns of thorns on people. They put a crown of thorns on him because he was claiming to be the king of the Jews, or really it was the Sanhedrin that claimed that he was claiming to be the king of the Jews in a sense, because they needed a reason for the Romans to crucify him, and just saying that he was being blasphemous would not have done it. And that was the real reason that they wanted him crucified, was because they said he was committing blasphemy and he was threatening their power. But when they went to Pilate, they said he's claiming to be king of the Jews, and that's where Pilate put the sign above the head on the cross that said King of the Jews, and they wanted that taken down because they were like, he's not the King of the Jews, and Pilate didn't care. So, but the Romans did put this crown of thorns on him because of supposedly that claim of being King of the Jews. And so again, that's kind of unique to Jesus and the gospel story as far as the crucifixion. And he was beaten severely, and that's a little bit unique as well as far as the crucifixion goes, because normally you go crucify somebody. But in this case, Pilate first said, well, just take him out and have him scourged. And that was going to be the end of it. So he was scourged. He got bruises on the cheeks. You can tell from the image on the shroud. And his forehead, a twisted nose, one eye is swollen half shut, a cut on the upper lip. So the person in the shroud was beaten. And then if you look at the shroud and all the blood marks, you've got scourge marks all over the body, front and back, from the legs, chest, and the back. 120 whipping wounds that are visible on really every part of the body. And here you see the hands. And I forgot to mention on that Prayer Codex, one of the things that it showed was, again, the hands were crossed just like they are in the shroud. And then also you don't see any thumbs, which is really interesting. So in that Prayer Codex, you see 4 fingers like this. Just like you have here, you don't see the thumbs. And the reason for that is when somebody's crucified, they crucify them, unlike what you see in the in pictures a lot of times where you see it through here, you actually crucify somebody through the wrist here, because if you would do it right here, it would rip right out. So they would put it through the wrist, through the bones here, and it would go through I think it's the medial nerve. And when you do that, then the thumb, when you compress that nerve, the thumb automatically goes in like this, which is why the fingers are like this. So that's pretty interesting too. And of course you see the blood right here where you expect it. And then there's also in the chest, there's a wound right where the Gospels record that they pierced Jesus, or they took a spear and thrust it into his chest to see if he was dead. And blood, it says blood and water came out. And that water would have been from, that happens a lot. You have water come out when a body's been under stress for that long, when they haven't been able to drink water, and Jesus, of course, was thirsty. So that's a normal kind of thing that you would expect. And that was found in the shroud as well. And here again, you can see the fingers, and you can see the blood all over the body, and the blood that dripped down here on the arm. So when they look at this from kind of a pathological kind of study, they say the man was in rigor mortis, and the wounds can be identified as pre-mortem and post-mortem. So the ones that you would expect, the crown, the whipping, and the nail wounds, are all pre-mortem, and then the chest wound, they can tell, was after death. And then his legs weren't broken, and that's interesting because in the scripture it tells us that his legs were not broken. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, after they speared him in the side, they did not break his legs. They would break the legs sometimes of somebody because the way that you died when you're being crucified was just awful. That's where the word, by the way, excruciating comes from, out of the cross, is where that word comes from. So when you're being crucified, basically you died of asphyxiation in a sense, because you'd be hanging there by your arms, and through nails, and then you have nails through your feet, usually one nail through your foot with both feet. And you'd have to get a breath, you'd have to push up on that nail, get a breath. And of course, his back was all scourged, so he's having to push up on this rough wooden cross to get a breath. And then he'd slump back down again. Then he's got, then he's hanging from his hands, and his shoulders are going out of joint. And if you read Psalm 23, I believe it is, he talks about, it's basically a description of what's written way before the crucifixion, or crucifixion was even thought of. It's a description of the crucifixion, where he's thirsty and his bones are out of joint. Talks about him them gambling for his clothes, everything that's in the gospel accounts. So bones are out of joint, and then he has to get another breath, so we'd push up on the nails to catch a breath. And a lot of times if they wanted somebody to die quicker, and the Jews were asking that he be taken down from the cross, they would break his legs, and then you couldn't push up, because you couldn't push up, and basically you die right there. You then finally asphyxiate, so his legs were not broken. This is really interesting. The man in the shroud was not unwrapped, because they could tell, the blood had clotted on the cloth, and if you had unwrapped somebody, it would have disturbed all of those clots and the borders around the clots. So he wasn't unwrapped, and the body didn't decompose in the cloth either. There was no evidence of decomposition, so it didn't remain in the shroud for more than a couple of days, which is interesting because we believe that Jesus was not unwrapped, that he just basically disappeared in the shroud. So and they found lots of burial shrouds. So it's not like, well, maybe there's others like this. They found hundreds of burial shrouds, and none other have an image. They basically they're a bloody mess. They've got blood and decomposition all over them. And the shroud instead has this double body image, both front and back, when you look at it. So here's the front, and there's the back. And you can see in this image, it's a little hard to see, but all of these little white, bright spots here, all the scourge marks on his back, and you've got the same thing on the front. And again, you've got the blood on the head, the blood on the back. You see the blood dripping down here from, again, what would have been the crown of thorns that was placed on his head. Something else that tells us that this is a unique cloth, in a sense. When people were crucified, they were not buried in a tomb in a nice piece of cloth. They were thrown in a ditch, basically, with a bunch of other people that were maybe crucified at the same time, in a common grave. But we know that Jesus wasn't from Scripture. We know from the gospel accounts that Joseph of Arimathea, who was a follower of his and who was a wealthy man, had a tomb that he had made for himself. And when they took Jesus' body down, he had requested the body, and he purchased a nice piece of cloth, fine piece of linen cloth, and he put Jesus in it, and he put Jesus in his own tomb. And then also we have from Isaiah, if you read Isaiah 53, it's basically a description of, and this is Isaiah from the Old Testament, hundreds of years before, 800 years, I think, before all of this happened. It says, he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. So, again, this is talking about the fact that Jesus, though he had led a sinless life, basically, was assigned a grave with the wicked. He hung on a cross next to between two thieves, and yet he was with the rich in his death. He was placed in this tomb. Yeah, Sharon, I'm going to talk about that in a second, the light within the body, or in a sense, the energy from within the body. That's true. So, something else. So there was a botanist who had gotten some samples from the shroud. This is him here taking, I think, some tape samples. And he found pollen that was from Turkey and Palestine. And again, the official historical record that a lot of people will say, okay, we'll leave it up to there, was France. So this shows us that it was, before France, it had been somewhere else, and it was actually really, a lot of these pollen samples would have been exclusively from around Israel. So we know that it must have been in Turkey and Israel earlier than that. And this is something that I have a hard time seeing. So people talk about it, and maybe if you were looking at these images closer up, they would make sense. But they say that there were coins placed over the eyes of the man buried in the shroud, and that the coins actually were from first century in Israel. And they show you, and I can't see it, so this is not as compelling to me, but they're showing you where different things match on these coins, and I can't really see that, but that's just something to note. And of course, the shroud's been kept all of this time as what the believers felt was the burial cloth of Jesus, and I believe the reason for that is that it was taken by the disciples, held on to, and then they kept it and they basically passed it on throughout the ages, kept as the real artifact. And scholars have looked at it, and again, if you look at it yourself, you can say, well, what would be the chances that some other crucified person could have had all of these same similarities on the cloth? Let's forget about the image for a second. Let's say there was no image on there, but you had the same kinds of blood stains or something like that. So it would be really improbable that you'd have them agree so closely. And then, yes, getting back to what you said, Sharon, here, the radiation, they believe radiation is the most likely reason for the image on the cloth, because you can look, when they look at the cloth and pictures of the positive image, you can actually see bones. You can see finger bones, you can see teeth, part of the skull at the forehead, the left thumb. So it is like an X-ray in a sense, and it came from inside the body, because you can't see anything that would have been outside the body. You can't see the cloth, image of the cloth. You can't see anything of the stuff that would have been in the cave. So the image, it looks like, came from inside the body, or the radiation. And they were able to make linen have a similar look when they applied radiation to it. I believe this is the actual shroud, and the image is so faint that what really amazes the scientists that looked at it, was that the image is just in the very, very, very top fibers of the linen. It doesn't go into it at all. That's how they knew it wasn't paint or anything like that. It's applied just like fiber by fiber is discolored. It's not anything that would have soaken through. The only thing on the shroud that's soaked through with the blood stains, that goes from front to back. But the image itself is just on the very top fibers, and it's fiber by fiber. It's not anything that's bleeded over. Each fiber is discolored. And they were able to do the same thing, exposing linen to radiation. And this other scientist who was on the STIRP team said the image formed in vertical straight line paths as if every pore and every hair of the body contained a micro miniature laser. So it's almost as if the radiation or laser or whatever it would have come out from every pore in that direction, because again, it formed a three-dimensional image. So you have to decide, what does it all mean? What could have caused this? Well, we've got today is Easter. It's Resurrection Day, and we're celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. And it's a miracle. It's a one-time event. Never happened before, and it's the basis of our faith. If the resurrection didn't happen, we would be without hope, as Scripture says. We would be pitied. So we've got this one-of-a-kind event that we believe in, that Jesus died, he was crucified, we know, and there are almost no historians of any worth that will not agree that Jesus was a historical person from Nazareth who was crucified by the Romans because of his preaching and his teaching. And many will say that he had a healing ministry, that he had a healing ministry. They don't believe he healed anybody, but he had this ministry, and that he was crucified by the Romans because the Jewish leaders at the time asked him that. They also will agree the tomb was empty. They'll agree that the disciples' behavior changed. So there's lots of things that historians, both those that are not believers, that secular skeptics like Bart Ehrman will believe happened, but they don't believe the miraculous part. So they don't believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Well, you've got all that evidence that Jesus was a real person, and you've got the eyewitness testimony, you've got the prophecy. Again, if you read Psalm 23, I think it is, I believe, and if you read Isaiah 53, just read those two chapters in the Bible. You've got a description in Isaiah 53, written 800 years before Jesus, about the suffering servant and how he died for many, how he was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And then you've got Psalm 23, where it kind of describes a crucifixion before crucifixion was even invented. So you've got that. And then you've got the shroud. And you've got this one-of-a-kind piece of cloth that matches the wounds of Jesus. And there's an image on there that even today we can't explain how it got there. Certainly how it would have gotten there even in the Middle Ages. We can't, how could somebody possibly create that fraud in the Middle Ages of something that even today would be amazing to us? And let's not forget that also nobody really appreciated how amazing it was until somebody first took a picture of it, the photography. So would somebody who made a fraudulent piece of cloth as an artifact go, I'm going to make this look really amazing to people once photography is invented. And then they'll actually see how amazing it is. Because nobody would have, I mean, people held on to it because they saw the image, a very faint image, and you had to look really closely at it. But nobody really appreciated how amazing it was until the first photograph was taken. So to believe that it's a fraud, I don't see how you could possibly believe that. The only other thing would be, there's three possibilities. It's a fraud. I don't see any way that's possible. It's some other crucified guy that just happens to match all the wounds that are in the accounts of the gospel. I don't believe that. Or it was Jesus, right? And then you have to say, well, if it was Jesus, okay, it was his cloth. Why is there an image on there? And the only explanation I have is that the resurrection. And you would imagine as the resurrection takes place, there would be a lot of energy, and then the image is put on the cloth. So just to think that it would be Jesus's burial cloth and there wasn't actually a resurrection doesn't make sense to me either. The only thing that makes sense to me is that this is the cloth that buried Jesus, and that we have basically a picture, a photograph of the resurrection. And I think that just the fact that this cloth was kept all through the ages and we have it today and we still can't explain it, to me, is just more proof that Jesus rose from the dead, and we celebrate that today. Jay says it's Psalm 22 and not 23. Thank you. Oh yeah, Psalm 23, duh. Yeah, that's the one that we all know. The Lord is my shepherd. So Psalm 22. Thanks, Jay. So anyway, I hope this was educational for you. I just love the shroud. I know there's some Christians out there that say we shouldn't not believe in this, but we shouldn't have our belief dependent on this. And my belief is not dependent on this. This is just one more piece of evidence for me. And I'm the kind of person that needs this kind of evidence. And I know that God knows that I need this kind of evidence. I look at things from a perspective of science, because I believe that nature, science, and religion all go together. I mean, basically, God created the world and created everything in it. And we have the evidence from Scripture. We have the evidence from His creation. And we have this evidence from the shroud as far as the resurrection of Jesus. So anyway, if you like the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I'd appreciate that. And thanks, Sharon. I appreciate that. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope we can all get back together soon in our class, because I miss seeing you guys. And I'll send an email out to make sure everybody's okay and find out if there's any prayer requests. But thanks for joining me. And next week, I'm going to continue on in the series that I did half of it last week, which was about how can a good God send people to hell? And that's a tough question. We covered some of that, and I'm going to cover some of the tougher questions about that as well as we go through that next week. So I will see you then. Oh, good. I'm glad you guys enjoyed. I'm glad the girls were watching. Hello, ladies. Good to talk at you. Thanks, Hank, and I'll see you guys later. And take care. Bye-bye.